Not too long ago, my wife and I were traveling down the highway with the kids in the back, and we had a really close shave. We were going about 80, and there are cars all around us, about five-lane highway. And we're driving along, and suddenly the truck in front of us, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this metal cage, you know the thing you put on the back of a trailer, it just flew up out of the truck, straight up in the air. It was incredible, but it was also terrifying because we were the next in line. And it was extraordinary. It landed right in front of us, but instead of landing on its side, on its horizontal like you'd expect it to, it landed vertically and just to the side of our lane so we could just swerve around, missing the metal cage and not hitting the car on our left. And it was such a close shave, and you know, your heart's beating really fast. I'm not sure if you've had a close shave like that before, but it never fails to remind you of how frail we are, our mortality in life. Some monks, they go down, these guys, Tibetan monks, they go down and they dig a grave. And each day, they all walk down there and they take in turns peering over the edge of the grave and pondering their own mortality. And when one of their number dies, they lower him down in the grave, they cover him with dirt, and then they dig another one, and they begin the ritual all over again, never sure who's going to be next to fill that grave. That's a rather morbid way to ponder your mortality. Most people laugh at our mortality, like Woody Allen. He says, "I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens." Except we all have this idea of our own mortality, and I think the one thing that reminds us of our mortality the most is the death of a loved one. It's just straight in our faces. Whether it's the death of a baby in the womb or a death of a dear friend before their time, this reminds us like nothing else of our own mortality. Death tears them away from this life, and suddenly we're reminded how life sucks. We all know that death comes for us and death comes for everyone around us, that death is horrible. And if this life is all there is and afterward we just become fertilizer like we're told to believe, then we're just living a tragic existence without hope, without comfort, without security. But today, as we look at this passage, the last part of 1 Corinthians 15, we're going to see that there is hope, there is confidence, there is security because there's more than this. Because there's something greater. Because today matters because of a never-ending tomorrow. That's what we're going to think about. There's more than this, there's something greater, so today matters because of a never-ending tomorrow. There's more than this. How do we know there's more than this? Well, because Jesus shows us there's more, doesn't he? When we read this passage at the start of this chapter, there's a convincing argument that Jesus shows there's more than this. Whenever I chat to guys who question God or question that Jesus came back from the dead, I always come to verse 6. I read verse 6 with them. Look at verse 6 there, at verse 15. After Jesus was executed on a cross, then it says here, then Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. So at the time Paul wrote this, he had solid evidence that Jesus shows there's more than this. If I told you that I did a double backflip off one of those balls in the sand, you know how they're doing that these days, you might not believe me, and that's understandable. But if someone else came and said, yeah, Matt did a double backflip off the ball in the sand, then maybe you start wonder, maybe Matt's working, and maybe he's practicing his backflips. But if 10 people came and told you that, then you're like, oh yeah. But imagine if it wasn't 10, it wasn't just 100, but 500 people all told you the same thing. It'd be ridiculous to doubt that. And yet, that's how many there were for Jesus coming back from the dead. More than 500 people saw it with their own eyes. There were 500 people who you could go and ask, and they would say beyond any doubt, Jesus shows death is not the end. Jesus shows there's more than this because he died and came back to life. And not only for Jesus, but for all of us who trust him. Look at verse 20. It says, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Ben stole my illustration, but it's a bit like the apple tree he had. When we're renting out down at Warren Ponds, there's all these trees in the backyard. I know horticulturalists, I didn't have a clue what they were. Someone said they were fruit trees. I'm like, oh, that's good. I had no idea what type of fruit tree they were. But imagine the first apple came on the tree, and I wouldn't be saying, oh, I wonder if it's going to be a banana or an orange next. We all know that the next fruit on that tree is going to be apple, and we know there's more apples to come. And so Jesus, being the first fruit, shows the type of fruit and shows that there's more to come. We don't have to be wondering if our resurrection is going to be like something different to Jesus. It's not going to be a banana or an orange. It's going to be the same as Jesus' resurrection because he's the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And this means that the acronym YOLO, I mentioned the acronym YOLO to my mum the other day. She wasn't sure what it was. YOLO, you only live once, is a lie. You don't only live once. Jesus shows us that the acronym, I think, should really be YOLT. You only live twice. How, though? How in the world could we live physically, bodily, how could we live twice? In our current state, the way we are, we can't live twice. We all know that. We would have to be changed, wouldn't we? And so look at verse 50 to 52 with me. It says, I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor can the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. We will be changed. And to all the teenagers or uni students who find it hard to wake up to your alarm, not even the dead will be able to stay asleep when this trumpet blast sounds. And in a moment, like looking up and blinking your eye, it's all going to be over. In a moment, we shall be changed. It's all over. Jesus shows us there's hope, that there's more than this, that death is not the end. And I wonder, I want you to wonder, how does believing this change your life? Does believing this change how you see death? Does believing this change how you live now? Keep thinking about that. Right now, God says there's more than this. There's something greater. We need something greater because bodies wear out. My skin gets wrinkles, my hair begins to thin at the back here, and that's why the dentist gets a fortune from me. That's why my father-in-law says I need to exercise to avoid a minister's spread. That's why my ma just spent 2 weeks in hospital for hip replacement surgery because of one fall and her brittle, frail bones. That's why my nana forgot who everyone around her was. That's why my pa whittled away by cancer. That's why my mum's cousin last Saturday, heart stopped and died at 57 years old. If this is all there is, if this life is all there is, then aging and death is terrifying. But look what happens in verse 53 to 54. It says, for this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Imagine that. Death being swallowed up in victory. Faces that don't wrinkle, hair that doesn't fall out, teeth that don't rot, bones that don't grow weak, memories that never fade, cancer that never happens, hearts that never stop, bodies that never die. Imagine that. When God changes us from mortal to immortal, from perishable to imperishable, then we were able to taunt death itself. That's what verse 55 is doing there. "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Do you hear the taunt? It's like, "Oh, death, what you got now? You got nothing." It's like you're taunting a weakling, someone pretty much defeated. And it's easy to do. It's easy to do that. I travel up to Melbourne and study with this guy named Ollie. Some of you probably know Ollie. He was here for a month last year. And, to be honest, I don't tell him this, but there's a certain line that I don't cross with Ollie, just because he's fairly fit and fighting. I skirt very close to it generally, but I don't cross it, except for one exception. The day I picked him up from hospital. He had just had a general anesthetic, and if you know what people like after general anesthetic, they're all drugged up and they really got nothing in them. And I could taunt him all I liked that day. I was ready to go for it then and there, no fear whatsoever, because he had nothing. And we can have that same attitude with death. Look at verse 56 and 57. "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." It's like death is drugged up and ready for a beating. It's weakened, it's defeated already, it just doesn't know it yet. And so we thank God that because of Jesus, He gives us the victory over death. The sting of death there refers to a scorpion sting, that word idea of sting. And what Jesus has done is He's grabbed that scorpion's tail and He's sunk it into Himself so that all who trust in Jesus are spared that same sting. What's the sting? It says the sting of death is sin. It's sin. It's judgment after death that we are spared. But even more than that, it's the pain of regret. That overwhelming remorse for broken relationships, despicable actions, missed opportunities, harsh words, repeated sins, flared up anger, all the thoughts of guilt that plague most people all the way to the grave and judgment beyond. That's part of the sting of death. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ, who in Jesus takes that burden of guilt from us, who lays it on His Son so that we don't go to the grave in our guilt, because Jesus took our judgment, He took our guilt onto Himself. That scorpion sting, He plunged it into Himself so that we are spared. So that, we die once, but the sting is gone because of Jesus. Instead, there's something more. There's something greater. It's only through Jesus that we can be sure that there's something more, something greater. I wonder, if you believe this, how does this change your life? How does this change how you live now? I'm not sure if you know why they put the flag at half-mast. It's not really always even halfway down the flagpole, is it? It comes back from back in the 18th century, when the French and the British and the Spanish and the pirates were all fighting on the high seas. And what would happen is if the British went and defeated a French vessel, they would take the French flag, they would wind the French flag down a little, and they'd put the British flag over the top to show that they have conquered this vessel and that the British now own this boat. And eventually it came about that when a death happened or someone died on the boat or on an island or something, they would take their flag down to show that the invisible flag of death had won another victory. So then we get to the half-mast idea today. But you can imagine, like in the days of, those TV shows like Hornblower, that's a great TV show, or Master and Commander or something like that. And you can imagine the captured vessel sailing past, and the brave captain boards his longboat, and he goes through the mist, boards the vessel, and he conquers it. And through the gun smoke, he says to his first mate, he says, "Run the colours back up," because he's won the victory. He can take down their flag, run the colours back up. And it's as though Jesus winning the victory, the invisible flag of death, is over each of our lives. And it's as though Jesus boards the longboat, And he boards it and he takes back that victory and he says, run the colors back up. And the invisible flag of death no longer flies over us because we have Jesus who gives us the victory over death. He has won that victory for us. And so we can have victory over death. Thanks be to God. But how does Jesus ultimately defeat death? In this chapter it says that Jesus is the last enemy to be defeated. Well, he first defeats it by coming back to life himself, but ultimately it's defeated by every single person who trusts in him, who he raises back to life, who gives an imperishable body, an immortal body to. That's how he defeats death. And one day, there'll be no more tears. One day, there'll be no more sickness. One day, there'll be no more death for everyone who trusts in Jesus because he died for us. He sacrificed for us. He came back to life for us. There's something more, there's something greater. So how does believing this change your life? How does it change how you live now? Just as YOLO, you only live once. You usually hear someone cry out YOLO and then do something stupid. It changes what they would normally do because of YOLO. YOLT, how does YOLT, you only live twice, how does it change your whole perspective today? Because it should. Because there's always going to be a tomorrow. Today matters because of a never-ending tomorrow. So for people who don't believe this, or maybe for people who are just unsure of this whole idea, could this even be possible? Oh, when life fails us, when it doesn't meet our expectations, because it inevitably does, when death stares us in the face again, we need to look to Jesus. Because there's something greater than this. This life isn't all there is. We all need something more. There's a life beyond the grave of joy and hope and life, a life with God for eternity. A little more than a month ago, in Geelong, was the funeral of a man named Shane Gallagher. I know some of you may have been there. And he died after struggling with cancer. But Tash gets up, his wife, mother of their 5-month-old boy Jasper, and she bravely gets up and she talks about how Shane stared death in the face without fear, without worry. And she said how their oncologist was amazed. And the oncologist just thought that Shane was being brave for Tash. So a week before he passed away, Tash tells the story, a week before he passed away, she had to duck out to change Jasper's nappy. And the oncologist turned to Shane and said, all right, here's your chance. Tell me anything that you're afraid of, anything you're worried about, anything you're anxious about. Tash is gone now. You can ask me anything. Tell me anything you're concerned about. And Shane says, Tash said, this is what Shane said. He turned to the oncologist and he said, I'm not fearful. I'm not anxious. I'm not worried about anything to do with my cancer. I'm not scared of dying. He was concerned for Tash and his son Jasper, but he was not scared of dying. And the oncologist was amazed, but Shane gets it. He knew that there's more than this. He knew there's something greater, and my longing is that we would all have the same confidence Shane had. That death is not the end, that there's a life of joy to come. And we see this because of Jesus and the undeniable truth that he came back to life. So it's not the end for Shane because he trusted that Jesus' death and life meant his life after death. And death doesn't have to be the end for you either. Because believing this, is a life of hope. And for those of you already, you know this, you believe this is true, and you agree with all of this, that there's a life to come. Well, don't get sucked up by YOLO, you only live once. I think YOLT gives even more meaning, it gives even more motivation to make the most of the present because there's a future. And so that's how Paul finishes this whole beautiful chapter in verse 58. these wonderful words. He says, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Never in vain. I wonder if you've ever slaved away at something really, really hard and you've worked so much for it, but it's all come to nothing. Do you know how frustrating that is? How annoying that is when you work so hard and it just all comes to naught? I know some nights I work late at night to do some assignments because Steph's in bed and the kids are in bed, it's easy to get something done. So some nights I'm working really hard and I'm so tired, and you're sort of doing the head nod, but you want to stay awake and you squint the eyes and you just keep going, push through even though you want to go to bed. And then I get all this assignment done and I go to bed, but the next morning I wake up, I go and read my assignment, but it's all gibberish. It means absolutely nothing. This one sentence I wrote, I said, even though Edwards does well in describing the need for more missionary work, he seems more interested in his new dog rather than leaving something out of his bag. And Jonathan Edwards has nothing to do with a new dog or a bag or anything. And all that work, that hard work, came to nothing. It was completely ridiculous. And I thought I'd done all this hard work, but it was all naught. And it's so frustrating. It's so annoying when that happens. But Paul tells us here that because of Jesus and the future to come, a Christian will not experience that. It's never in vain. It doesn't come to nothing. Our labor, our hard work in the Lord is not in vain. And that labor, that idea is sweat on the brow. This is hard work that you're pushing through. That is never in vain. I recently heard of a woman missionary where she was captured and she was in the trenches, digging in the trenches, in a trench with some others, and a dog with rabies jumped in the trench and he's about to attack all these people, and they're trying to fend off the dog with these sticks, but not this woman. She dives on the dog and holds the dog down so no one else is bitten. But in the process, she gets bitten and infected by rabies. And she has to be isolated. And she dies a slow, terrible death. And if this life is all there is, she just wasted. What a waste. There's no point to that. Except if there's a life to come, if there's life after death, it means she used her body to save others. That's not a waste. That's not a waste, because a time is coming where she'll be walking on a new earth in a new body that will not die alongside others who know of Jesus, because God used her labor, that sacrifice for Him. As a Christian, we don't lose out. There's always purpose. Nothing we do in the Lord is ever in vain. So parenting can feel like a chore. Two things never end: discipline and laundry. Work can feel like a slog. But loving our workmate, providing for others, living as Christ would, it's never in vain. Praying and reading the Bible with our kids, even though it's after an exhausting, hard day's work and we're absolutely tired and zonked, it's never in vain. Getting up on a Sunday, even though we're tired and we might not feel like coming along, to encourage each other and to remind each other of this good news of the hope we have in Jesus is never in vain. Giving to gospel work is never in vain. Spending time getting to know our friends and schoolmates and spending time loving our family, our extended family, even though that relationships always take time, it's never in vain. Doing mainly music, even though it's another thing in the week on top of everything else, it's never in vain. Bringing up religion and Jesus as we go is never in vain. Even though it's sometimes awkward or embarrassing to bring up religion, even if it's hard, nothing we do in the Lord is a waste. And this is part of the joy of the Christian life, that there's more than this. There's something greater. So today matters because of a never-ending tomorrow. And so, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is never in vain. Let's pray to God and thank Him for this beautiful truth.